Wife and mother-in-law are pregnant at the same time. I stood in the hospital hallway, clutching two ultrasound slips in my hand, feeling like the whole world was spinning out of control. One is for my wife Lynn, 6 weeks pregnant. The other is for my mother-in-law, 8 weeks pregnant. I leaned against the wall, trying to calm my breathing. The smell of antiseptic water irritated my nostrils, reminding me of the scene in the consulting room earlier. "Congratulations, you're going to be a father," the doctor said to Lynn and I with a smile. Lynn leaned on my shoulder with a red face, and I wrapped my arms around her waist. My heart was happy. After 3 years of marriage, we are finally going to have our own children. But just as we were about to leave, my mother-in-law suddenly rushed into the restroom with her mouth covered. I subconsciously followed her over, only to hear her dry heaving inside. "Mom, are you okay?" Lynn asked worriedly. Mother-in-law waved her hand, probably something bad from the morning meal. But I noticed that her face didn't look quite right. At my insistence, my mother-in-law also had a checkup. When the results came out, the doctor's eyes changed when he looked at me. "This is also your wife?" the doctor asked hesitantly. I almost didn't stand still. My mother-in-law was 42 years old, well-maintained, and looked like she was in her early 30s. But this was outrageous. "No, this is my mother-in-law," I spoke with difficulty. The doctor coughed awkwardly. "Congratulations on your family's double happiness." I walked out of the hospital in a muddle, and my mind was in a mess. Father-in-law died many years ago. Mother-in-law has been single. This child. Whose is it? When we got home, Lynn excitedly started planning the nursery while I was distracted. Mother-in-law sat on the couch with her head down and didn't say anything. "Mom," I spoke hesitantly, "this child." Mother-in-law jerked her head up, a flash of panic in her eyes. "Ethan, this thing." "Honey." Lynn suddenly came running out of the bedroom with her cell phone. "Look at this. This crib is so cute." I had to swallow back the words that were on my lips. At night, I lay in bed, tossing and turning, unable to sleep. Lynn was already asleep, breathing evenly. I gently got up and walked to the living room. Moonlight poured in through the window, and I saw my mother-in-law sitting in a rocking chair on the balcony, holding a picture frame in her hand. That's a wedding picture of her and her father-in-law. I stood in the doorway and watched as she gently caressed the photo, her shoulders trembling slightly. At this moment, I suddenly realized that this woman, who had always been strong and elegant in my impression, actually had a vulnerable side. "Mom," I called to her softly. Mother-in-law scrambled to wipe away her tears and forced a smile. "Why are you still awake?" I walked over and sat down in the chair next to her. "Couldn't sleep. Thinking about that kid." Mother-in-law was silent for a moment and whispered, "Ethan, I know this is bothering you. But this child, I have to have it." I looked into her determined eyes and suddenly remembered the first time I met her 5 years ago. I was just in a relationship with Lynn at the time and went to her house for the first time. My mother-in-law was wearing an evening gown and elegantly poured tea for me. Her temperament reminded me of the gentle women of the Jiang and Watertown. "Ethan, right?" She smiled. "Lynn was spoiled by me growing up, so you'll have to bear with me from now on." I was thinking that with such a gentle mother, it's no wonder she could teach a girl as kind as Lynn. "Mom," I took a deep breath, "this baby was an accident?" Mother-in-law's hand trembled slightly. "It wasn't an accident. It was me. I initiated it." I looked at her in shock. The side of her face looked pale in the moonlight. "That guy is my former first love," she said softly. "We separated when we were young because of some misunderstandings. When we reunited by chance some time ago, I clenched my fists and had mixed feelings in my heart. My mother-in-law had always been a very traditional person, and I didn't think she would do something like this. "Ethan," she suddenly grabbed my hand. "Can we not tell Lynn about this yet? She's pregnant right now, and I'm afraid she'll be irritated." I looked at her pleading eyes and felt a pang in my heart. This woman who had always treated me like her own son was at this moment like a child who had done something wrong. Good. I nodded, but Mom, think about it. It's dangerous to be pregnant at this age and… I know. She interrupts me, but Ethan, this is my last chance. I gave up a lot for Lynn back then. Now, I want to live for myself for once. I was silent. Yes, mother-in-law has been a widow for Lynn for so many years. Now that Lynn has her own family, it's time for her to have her own life. So, child's father know? I asked. Mother-in-law shook her head. He doesn't know. I'm not going to tell him either. This child, I will raise on my own. I looked at her stomach, and although I couldn't see much right now, there was a little life being nurtured there. And that life is going to change the landscape of our family forever. Mom, I held her hand. I'll support you no matter what happens. But it's only a matter of time before we have to tell Lynn about this. Mother-in-law nodded, tears finally falling. Thank you, Ethan. You're such a good man. I laughed bitterly and shook my head. Good people? All I could feel right now is a headache. When Lynn finds out about this, there's no telling what kind of a fuss she'll make. The next morning, I went to work with a black eye. Just as I arrived at the office, I got a call from Lynn. Honey. Her voice was full of excitement. I just talked to Mom, and we're going to go to the maternity checkup together. I almost dropped my phone. What? Together. Right. It's hard for you to match me now when it's not Mom who's going with me. Lynn acted as if she didn't notice I was different. I held my forehead, feeling my temples jutting. Lynn, I tried to sound as normal as possible. Mom, she hasn't been feeling too well lately. Why don't we just have separate checkups? Geez, it's just because you're not well that you need to be together. Lynn was unimpressed. Wouldn't it be better to have me around to take care of it? I was about to say something else when she had hung up. I slumped in my chair, feeling my future was dark. Sure enough, something happened in the afternoon. I was working on a report when my cell phone suddenly vibrated like crazy. It was a message from Lynn, a dozen in a row. Honey, something big is going on. Mom, she's pregnant. Jesus, what the hell is going on here? You've got to come to the hospital. I grabbed my jacket and rushed out the door, completely ignoring the surprised stares of my coworkers. When she arrived at the hospital, Lynn was sitting on a bench in the hallway, her face pale. Her mother-in-law stood by, at her wit's end. Lynn. I walked over cautiously. Lynn looked up, her eyes filled with tears. You knew, didn't you? I opened my mouth, not knowing how to explain. Why did you hide it from me? She asked, choking back a sob. I'm your wife. It's such a big deal. Lynn, mother-in-law stepped forward. It's Mom's fault. It's Mom who made Ethan hide it from you. Mom. Lynn stood up suddenly. Why are you doing this? Do you realize that this is dangerous? And she couldn't talk anymore and threw herself into my arms and cried. I gently patted her back and looked at my mother-in-law. She stood there like a child who had done something wrong, her eyes filled with guilt. At this moment, I suddenly realized that the family might be about to go through a huge storm. Lynn was tired of crying and fell asleep in my arms. I gently picked her up and said to my mother-in-law, Mom, let's go home first. Mother-in-law nodded and followed us silently. Back home, I settled Lynn in and gently closed the bedroom door. Mother-in-law sat on the couch in the living room, her hands clasped together. I poured her a cup of hot water and sat down across from her. Mom, I whispered, can you tell me what's going on now? Mother-in-law looked up with tears in her eyes. Ethan, I'm sorry. I know this whole thing is difficult for you guys, but… She took a deep breath and began to tell the long, dusty story. It turns out that mother-in-law's first love when she was young was named Vincent, a painter. The two had been in love for many years, but because Vincent wanted to go abroad for further study, mother-in-law's parents did not agree that they should be together. Later, mother-in-law married Lynn's father under her parents' arrangement, and Vincent also stayed abroad. Some time ago, he returned to China for a painting exhibition. Mother-in-law whispered, we reunited. He said he never got married and is still waiting for me. I looked at her in shock. So you guys? Mother-in-law nodded. I know it's not right. But Ethan, I've lived my whole life for other people. Listening to my parents when I was young, marrying and raising my children, raising Lynn alone after my husband died, and now that Lynn has you, I can finally live for myself for once. I was silent. Yes, my mother-in-law had given her whole life, and it seemed unjustifiable that she now wanted to pursue her own happiness. I sighed helplessly. Mom, this isn't that simple. Lynn sighed. As she was talking, the bedroom door burst open. Lynn stood in the doorway, her face pale. Mom, her voice shook a little. What you just said. All true. Mother-in-law scrambled to her feet. Lynn, listen to Mom explain. Explain what? Lynn suddenly raised her voice. Explain that you went behind my back to your first love? Explaining that you're still having kids at your age? Do you know what people will say? Lynn, I rushed up to her and pulled her back. Come on, Mom, You knew that already, didn't you? Lynn turned to me, disappointment in her eyes. You guys worked together to lie to me. I was momentarily speechless. Mother-in-law stepped forward. Lynn, it's Mom's fault. Don't blame Ethan. Get out, all of you. Lynn suddenly yelled, I don't want to see you. My mother-in-law and I looked at each other and helplessly exited the room. The moment I closed the door, I heard suppressed cries coming from inside. Mother-in-law sat, paralyzed on the sofa, covering her face and crying. I stood aside, feeling powerless like never before. In the next few days, the atmosphere in the house was extremely depressing. Lynn stopped talking to her mother-in-law and locked herself up in her room every day. Her mother-in-law, on the other hand, acted like a child who had done something wrong, taking care of Lynn's food and living carefully. I'm caught in the middle, and I'm in a dilemma. I have to go to work during the day and come home at night to mediate between two women, and the whole thing is falling apart. It wasn't until that night that things took a turn for the worse. I was working late in my study when I suddenly heard a scream from the living room. I rushed out and saw Lynn collapsed on the floor, her face pale. Lynn. I rushed over and hugged her. What's wrong? Stomach. It hurts, Lynn said weakly. My mother-in-law, who had also heard the news, saw the scene and immediately said, it might be a preeclampsia. Send her to the hospital quickly. We scrambled to get Lynn to the hospital. After examination, the doctor said it was caused by too many mood swings and needed to be hospitalized for observation. I stayed in front of the hospital bed. Looking at Lynn's pale face, my heart was filled with guilt. Mother-in-law stood at the door, wanting to come in but not daring to. Mom, I whispered, come in. Mother-in-law hesitated and slowly walked to the bedside. Lynn opened her eyes and saw her mother-in-law. Tears came out at once. Mom. She choked out, I'm sorry. Mother-in-law also cried and held Lynn's hand. It's Mom's fault. It's Mom who made you worry. I watched the mother and daughter embrace each other, and a big stone finally fell from my heart. The next day, Lynn's condition stabilized. My mother-in-law went home to cook and I stayed at the hospital with her. Honey, Lynn said suddenly, I figured it out. I took her hand. Figured out what? Mom's been there for us all her life, she said softly, and now she wants to pursue her own happiness, and we should support her. I looked at her in surprise. You really think so? Lynn nodded. Actually, I'm angry not because Mom's pregnant, but because she kept it from me. I felt left out. I sighed in relief. So when Mom gets here, you'll talk to her? As she was talking, her mother-in-law came in with a thermos bucket, and Lynn looked at her and whispered, Mom, I'm sorry. Mother-in-law froze for a moment, then her eyes reddened. Silly boy, it's Mom who should say she's sorry. My heart warmed as I watched the reunited mother and daughter. But I know that this is just the beginning. With the birth of 2 children, the family will face many more challenges. However, just when I thought everything was going in the right direction, an unexpected visitor shattered the peace. That afternoon, I was at the hospital with Lynn when I suddenly received a call from my mother-in-law. Ethan, She sounded a little panicked. Can you come back here? The house. There's someone here. My mind tightened. Who? It's Vincent, whispered mother-in-law. He heard somewhere that I was pregnant and came to my door. I sucked in a breath of cold air. It was time, after all. I hurried home, and as soon as I entered I saw a strange man sitting in the living room. He looked to be around 50, wearing a beige trench coat, with a thin face and deep eyes. When he saw me come in, he stood up and nodded politely. This is Ethan, right? He smiled. I'm Vincent. I nodded and looked over at my mother-in-law. She was sitting on the couch, her head down, her fingers twisted together uneasily. Mr. Chow, I tried to sound as calm as I could. You're here this time too. Vincent sighed. I heard Mei-Ling was pregnant, so I wanted to confirm it. Mother-in-law stood up suddenly. Vincent, let's talk outside. I looked at my mother-in-law's pale face and felt a pang of unease in my heart. Mom, if there's anything you want to say it here. Mother-in-law shook her head. Ethan, this is between him and me. Let us work it out. I still wanted to say something. Vincent had already followed his mother-in-law out the door. I stood in the doorway, looking at their backs, with mixed feelings in my heart. That night, my mother-in-law came home late. I sat in the living room waiting for her and saw her eyes red as she entered. Mom, I asked softly, how did you guys talk? My mother-in-law sat next to me and was silent for a moment before she said, Vincent said, he wants to be in charge. I frowned. Responsible? What do you mean? He said he wanted to marry me, whispered the mother-in-law, to give the children a complete home. I looked at her in shock. You promise? Mother-in-law shook her head. No. I told him that I would raise this child on my own and not be responsible for him. I was relieved, but still a little uneasy inside. So what did he say? He said he would respect my decision. The mother-in-law smiled bitterly, but he wanted to come and see the children more often. I was silent. This whole thing was more complicated than I thought. The next day, I went to see Lynn at the hospital and told her about it. What? Lynn's eyes widened. That man wants to marry Mom? I nodded, but Mom refused. Lynn frowned. Honey, you said. Aren't we being too selfish? I froze. What do you mean? Mom's been there for us all her life, Lynn said softly, and now it's so hard to meet true love, and we're. I took her hand. Are you saying that we should support Mom and Vincent together? Lynn nodded. If Mom really loves him, we should give her our blessing. I sighed, but Lynn, have you thought about it? What would this family be like if Mom and Vincent got married? Lynn was silent. Yeah, this family was complicated enough as it was. Add a Vincent to the mix and things would only get more confusing. Once Lynn's condition stabilized, we returned home, and I later hired an experienced nanny through a friend to take care of 2 pregnant women who were becoming increasingly inconvenienced. As time went on, Lynn and her mother-in-law's bellies grew, and the atmosphere in the house slowly eased. Although Lynn still had some mixed emotions about her mother-in-law's decision, her heart softened when she saw how careful her mother was every day. For her part, mother-in-law took care of Lynn even more carefully, as if she was making up for her previous concealment. Vincent comes to visit his mother-in-law at home occasionally, and each time he brings some nutritious food or items needed by a pregnant woman. His arrival always made the atmosphere in the house a little delicate, but everyone tacitly agreed not to say anything more. Lynn's attitude towards Vincent also gradually became peaceful from the initial resistance. She began to realize that this man might really be able to bring happiness to her mother. One night, Lynn suddenly said to me, Honey, I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I think we should support Mom and Vincent being together. I looked at her with some surprise. You really think so? Lynn nodded her head with a hint of relief in her eyes. Mom has been working for us all her life, and now that she has finally found her happiness, we shouldn't be a hindrance to her. Besides, Vincent seems like a nice guy, and he's very devoted to Mom. I held her hand and was a bit touched in my heart. It's really good that you can think this way. However, this matter still depends on Mom's opinion. We can't make the decision for her. Lynn smiled. I know, that's why I'm going to have a talk with Mom. The next day, Lynn walked in while her mother-in-law was in the kitchen preparing lunch. I stood outside the door and heard them talking softly. Mom, Lynn's voice was soft and firm. I want to talk to you about Vincent. Mother-in-law's hand paused for a moment. Then she put down the kitchen knife in her hand and turned around. Lynn, are you still blaming me? Lynn shook her head and held her mother-in-law's hand. Mom, I'm not blaming you. I just think that if you really love Vincent, we should support you. You've spent your whole life paying for us, and now it's time to live for yourself for once. My mother-in-law's eyes reddened and her voice choked a little. Lynn, do you really think so? Lynn nodded and tears welled up in her eyes. Mom, you're the most important person to me, and I want you to be happy. Vincent seems like a nice guy, and we can try to accept him if you want. Tears finally fell from her mother-in-law's eyes as she hugged Lynn tightly, her voice trembling. Thank you, Lynn. Mom really doesn't know how to thank you. I stood outside the door and watched the mother and daughter embrace each other, and a warmth welled up in my heart. Perhaps the family was going through a huge change, but as long as everyone's hearts were together, everything would be fine. A few days later, Vincent came to the house again. This time, Lynn took the initiative to greet him, and her attitude was much gentler than before. Mother-in-law sat on the sofa, looking a little nervous, but with a hint of anticipation in her eyes. Vincent, mother-in-law spoke softly. I talked to Lynn and she supports us being together. Vincent's eyes instantly lit up and a delighted look appeared on his face. Really? Mei Ling, you're willing to accept me? Mother-in-law nodded, a blush spreading across her face. But I hope you understand that this family is very important to me. Lynn and Ethan are the closest people to me, and I don't want it to affect them because of our relationship. Vincent nodded solemnly. I understand. I'll respect your decision, and I'll do my best to fit in with the family. Lynn, Ethan, he turned to us, his tone sincere. I know my presence may make you all uncomfortable, but I really do love Mei Ling, and I hope that you'll give me a chance as well. Lynn looked at me and I nodded, signaling her to make a decision. Lynn took a deep breath and said to Vincent, Uncle, Ethan and I have discussed this, and we are willing to support you and Mom to be together. However, we hope you can treat Mom well and not let her suffer anymore. Vincent's eyes flashed with a hint of emotion and he nodded solemnly. I promise you that I will take good care of Mei Ling, and I will also try my best to make up for what I owed her over the years. Just like that, Vincent officially became a member of our family. Although everyone was a bit uncomfortable at first, Vincent's care and consideration gradually won everyone's trust as time went by. As the due date approaches, the atmosphere at home becomes tense and busy. As his mother-in-law and Lynn's tummies get bigger and bigger and their mobility becomes more and more difficult, Vincent comes to the house almost every day to help out and sometimes accompanies his mother-in-law to the hospital for a maternity checkup. One night, I was dealing with work in my study when I suddenly heard a rush of footsteps coming from the living room. I rushed out and saw my mother-in-law covering her stomach and looking pale. Mom, what's wrong with you? I asked nervously. Mother-in-law frowned, her voice a little weak. I seem to be in labor. I immediately panicked and hurriedly called an ambulance. Vincent heard the commotion and also rushed over, and when he saw his mother-in-law's appearance, he immediately went forward to hold her. Mei Ling, don't be afraid. I'll accompany you to the hospital. Lynn was also awakened and came out of her room with her big belly, and her face became tense when she saw the scene. Mom, are you okay? Mother-in-law forced a smile. It's fine. It's probably about to give birth. Lynn, don't worry. Take care of yourself. The ambulance arrived soon and Vincent accompanied his mother-in-law to the hospital. Lynn and I stayed at home, but our hearts were in turmoil. Lynn held my hand. Her voice trembled a little. Honey, is Mom going to be okay? I reassured her. Don't worry, Mom's always been in good health. She'll be fine. However, there is also some uneasiness in my heart. After all, my mother-in-law is old, and it is very risky to have a baby at this age in case of any accidents. A few hours later, Vincent finally called. I hurriedly picked it up. Uncle, how's Mom? Vincent's voice was tinged with fatigue, but more than anything else it was joy. Mei-Ling gave birth. It's a boy. Mother and child are safe. I breathed a sigh of relief and rushed to tell Lynn the good news. When Lynn heard it, tears sprang to her eyes. That's great. Mom is fine. That's great. Early the next morning, Lynn and I rushed to the hospital. My mother-in-law was lying on the hospital bed. Her face was a bit pale, but she was in good spirits. Vincent was sitting beside the bed, holding a tiny baby in his arms. His face was full of happy smiles. Lynn, Ethan, you're here. Mother-in-law saw us, and a gentle smile appeared on her face. Lynn walked over and gently held her mother-in-law's hand. Mom, you've worked hard. Mother-in-law shook her head, her eyes full of love. It's not hard. Seeing this little guy makes everything worth it. Vincent handed Lynn the baby. Here, hold your brother. Lynn carefully picked up the baby with tenderness in her eyes. He's so tiny. As I watched the scene, a warmth welled up in my heart. This family had been through many ups and downs, but eventually a new life and new hope had arrived. A month later, Lynn also gave birth to a healthy boy. The family became lively with 2 more little lives all of a sudden. Mother-in-law and Vincent took care of the 2 children together, and Lynn and I slowly adapted to parenthood. Though the family has become more complicated than ever, everyone works hard to maintain the balance. Vincent's addition to the family makes his mother-in-law more cheerful, and Lynn grows to accept the new family structure. One night, I was sitting on the balcony, looking at the sky full of stars. This family has gone through so many changes, but in the end, everyone has found their own happiness. Lynn came over and gently leaned on my shoulder. Honey, what are you thinking? I held her hand and said softly, I was thinking that this family has been through a lot, but it has finally come to this day. Perhaps this is life. There will always be surprises, but there will always be hope. Lynn nodded, her eyes filled with tenderness. Yeah, as long as we're together, we can overcome any difficulty. I look at her and my heart is filled with gratitude. This home may not be perfect, but it's the imperfections that make us appreciate each other even more. The night breeze blew gently, carrying a hint of coolness. I put my arm around Lynn's shoulders and prayed silently in my heart. May this family be happy forever, and may we all find our own peace and happiness in this complicated life.